Thank you all. Thank you all for joining me and us this morning. This is a real pleasure, and thanks to all the sponsors also for this wonderful program. I was unable to make the program last year in Cranbrook. I was with a group of students abroad, so it's been really great to be able to participate in this program. Um, I'd also like to thank the Korob family. They really opened themselves up to this project, this work, and the research that went into the book project that came out a couple of years ago, and it was really a wonderful experience. I I studied architecture at the University of Michigan for my graduate degree program, and that's when I met Balthazar. When I was a graduate student, I helped hang up an exhibition of his work at the university, and that was now 17 years ago. We kept in touch over the years, and that led to a book project years later. So I always tell my students now, whenever you're asked to help out with something like hanging up an exhibition, you should say yes, because you have no idea where that will lead 17 or 15 years later. Um, so I wanted to start this talk really well, first I'll give a brief introduction to Balthazar's biography. I want to sort of set the context for Balthazar's relationship to the content of this symposium on Michigan modernism. But in order to do so, I sort of have to explain how Balthazar ended up here in Michigan in the first place. So I'll give a bit of a biography, sketch of his biography and how he came to the United States. But I really also wanted to, in this talk in particular, focus on the theme of the symposium. This is the first couple of sentences from the introduction on the panel in the exhibition that I'm sure all of you have seen. From the start of the 20th century through today, Michigan has led the charge to define and shape the future with design, building on the entrepreneurial foundations of the automotive industry. Michigan became an incubator of technological advancement, artistic achievement, and stylistic invention, offering revolutionary new visions for modern life. I think Eric Hill did a wonderful job in contextualizing that as well. So I tried to piece together samples of Balthazar's career, in particular his work either here in Michigan or work with architects from Michigan, and really tried to show the broad range of his work, engaging in those technological advancements, artistic achievement, and stylistic invention. So for me, this really the project, my research on Balthazar, in many ways started with this image. After I did an interview with him, after I helped hang up his exhibition, I thought, wow, this man's life story is fantastic in addition to his work. And so I did an interview with him for our college publication at the University of Michigan. And after that came out, he offered to print any of his images for me that I wanted. And this was the image that I chose for him to print, which he gave to me as a gift. And it's an image that he took in 1952 when he was in Paris as an architecture student, studying architecture and working in the office of Le Corbusier's Paris studio. And during that time, he visited Villa Savoye, one of the, as you I'm sure all know, iconic modern dwellings. And he took this picture in the bathroom. This was after World War II. The house was in great disarray. And for me, this photograph really, in many ways, encapsulates a lot of the characteristics and qualities of Balthazar's photography, what came to be his photographic practice. And these three ideas off to the right, I just wanted to sort of plant seeds in your minds to think about as we look through his career. This idea of an ordered spontaneity. He really was trained in art. He wanted to be a painter. And so he had a great facility in artistic practices, which I think in many ways contributed to his ability for composition and balance, many of the ideas that artists and painters are trained to think about. And yet there's also a certain spontaneity to his work, which I think you'll see in a lot of that. The other is that he always considered himself to be an architect first. He talked about himself as an architect who makes photographs rather than a photographer who's knowledgeable about architecture. And in this case, he had, like I said, he was working in the office of Le Corbusier, and I think in many ways this was one of his first explorations in trying to encapsulate the ideas of an architect or of a building in a kind of comprehensive manner. And then the other is this idea of a full and contested lives of architecture. That for Balthazar, the notion that you could sort of sum up a building in one image was ludicrous in many ways for him. He kept returning to projects years later, and really tried to encapsulate these full and contested lives of a building. And this photograph, I think, really represents that commitment to not just capturing the ideal image of a building, but really the understanding that buildings change and transform over time, and the events and the people, the occupation of those buildings are as much about their story as is any sort of large overarching idea. As I mentioned, he was trained as an artist. Balthazar was born in 1926 in Budapest, Hungary, and he was trained in the arts. He had an amazing facility for drawing and painting and sculpture, and he started studying architecture at the Polytechnic in Budapest, and that education was interrupted by World War II, the Nazi occupation of Budapest, and then, of course, later in the war, the Soviet liberation of the city from the Nazis. Some of these images were actually taken after his family fled the city. These are some of the very first photographs. His father had purchased a Leica camera from a German soldier who was retreating from the Eastern Front, a Russian-made Leica, and that was the first camera he had. And this image on the right is one of his first photographs that he took as he and his family and many others were fleeing the city during World War II. And this is a sketch from his sketchbook of the same time period. And I think you can see a similar sensibility, but also this need on Balthazar's part to really try to capture what was happening in his life. He always had a camera with him and a sketchbook with him, and he was constantly documenting his life, which I think lends to a certain kind of documentarian quality to his work as well. In 1949, New Year's Day, 1949, Balthazar and one of his friends from architecture school and his younger brother made the decision to flee the country. His father had been imprisoned for some time, and he and his family felt like it was time for him to leave. So they boarded a train and disembarked the train at a station that was as close to the Austrian border as they could get, and they chose New Year's Day, 1949, because they figured a lot of the border guards would be hung over from the New Year's Eve celebrations the night before. They had white sheets to camouflage themselves in the snow, and they took only their most essential belongings with them, basic food rations and essential belongings. And Balthazar, among his essential belongings, was his camera. And these are some of the images that he took during their trek, not only into Austria, but then throughout Europe en route, in his case, to Paris. He was fluent in French at the time, so he figured that would serve him well in Paris, and he wanted to complete his architecture studies. One of his first jobs was working as a night watchman in the 18th district in Paris. This is a photograph of that district in the Moulin Rouge. You can faintly see that in the image. So he worked at this job and was able to convince many of the leaders of the École des Beaux-Arts to admit him as an architecture student with advanced standing based on his 2 years of education in Hungary. These are some images that he took in the design studios at the École des Beaux-Arts, and he was in one of the most avant-garde studios at the time, led by the Italian architect Otello Zavaroni. And these are just some of the images, samples of the work that he produced during his time there as a student. And you can see some of the sensibilities. He was incredibly facile with both hardline drawings, watercolor washes, prints, and really you can see also this investigation of light and texture, the kinds of explorations that would later serve a photographer of architecture well. He also was interested in these kinds of eventscapes, right? Architecture not just as a static object, but architecture in a kind of the most theatrical sense. This being the design for a water show that he did as a student, and this is an elevation drawing or wash at the top, and then a photograph of his model for that same project. And I think this was one of the first examples of Balthazar using photography as part of the design process, and also the presentation of a design idea, something that would certainly serve him well later in his career. In fact, he was so good at this kind of model photography that many of his fellow students would enlist him in photographing their models as well for some of their final presentations. These are some collage drawings of his final diploma project, where you can see him employing, again, photography as not just something that represents a completed work, but something that is part of the design process, using collage, photo transfer, many of the kind of cutting edge technology, imaging technologies of the time. And this is a sample of one of his very large scale drawings. The École des Beaux-Arts was known for their very large scale drawings. And in this case, you can see that textured pattern on the elevation is a photo transfer of an image that he took of paint peeling in the bathroom of the École des Beaux-Arts. And so he was sourcing kind of imagery and materials from the world around him. During his studies, as I mentioned, he worked for several architects throughout Europe, Le Corbusier being one of them, and he met André Wojcinski, who was one of the project managers, I guess you could say, in Le Corbusier's Paris studio, who designed this house for himself and his wife Martha Pan, the sculptor, Hungarian sculptor. Balthazar, no matter where he went, he always was able to seek out other Hungarians and create a kind of circle of compatriots. And so Wojcinski designed this house and studio for himself and Marta Pan, and this was in many ways one of Balthazar's first commissions as a photographer of architecture. He was asked to photograph this house, and it was, like I said, one of his earliest commissions in 1952. He also traveled extensively during his time at the Beaux-Arts from 1952 to 55. I'm sorry, 50 to 55. And these are just a sampling of some of the images from those travels. I found a box filled with, I'm estimating, 3,600 images from his travels throughout mostly France and Italy, but elsewhere in Europe as well. And you can see the range of exploration in just this sample of work, this kind of documentarian quality in the upper right. Still documenting some of the destruction of from World War II, to the more kind of avant-garde, let's say, imagery of the image from the Eiffel Tower, very reminiscent of, say, the photographs of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy or Rodchenko, Alexander Rodchenko. And then this more kind of pictorial imagery, the image in the lower right, which he shot at Mont Saint-Michel. In the Abbey at Mont Saint-Michel. And that trip in particular was instrumental in his life and career. He and a friend were traveling through France together, and on that trip, he met Sally Dow, an American woman who was in Paris studying piano. And they struck up a relationship when they returned to Paris and were ultimately married. And Sally Dow They were married before he completed his studies, and he wanted to go work for Oscar Niemeyer. That was his plan, to move to Brazil and work for Oscar Niemeyer after he finished his studies. And Sally convinced him to stop in Michigan for a month to spend time with her family before they moved to Brazil. She'd been in Paris for several years and wanted to spend some time with her family, and that's what brought Balthazar to Michigan. Coincidentally, this was last night. I introduced myself to Jim Miller, who I think many will hear him in conversation after this session. And I was talking to Jim and asking him if he had ever met Balthazar, and his face lit up, and he said, "Well, let me tell you about Balthazar." He said, "Yeah, I married his ex-wife." After they came to the United States, Sally and Balthazar were divorced, and Jim had known Sally for years earlier when they were children, and they struck up a relationship and were married for 45 years. So small world. But Sally Dow, as I mentioned, her family lived in Southeast Michigan, and when they arrived in Michigan, Balthazar was well, as he put it, he was kind of bored. And so he, unbeknownst to him, his in-laws lived about a mile away from Eero Saarinen's office and studio in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. And Balthazar cold called the office, got an interview with Eero and Kevin Roach, showed them some photographic reproductions of his drawings at the Beaux-Arts, and they offered him a job and a cigar and asked him to return after lunch and start working. And that really touched off a major part of his career. These are just some of the office shots. Balthazar, as I mentioned, always had a camera with him, and really soon was not only documenting the life of the place, of the very vibrant office at the time, but became enlisted in some of the internal, he really became the internal photographer for the studio. Shooting both models, the design process itself, and then later the finished project. So I want to touch on two projects in particular that I go into a little bit more in depth in the book I did on Balthazar, because he had such a critical and sustained relationship with these two projects in the office: the Miller House in Columbus, Indiana, and the TWA terminal at JFK Airport. One of the first things that he was asked to work on in the office was the sculptural fireplace to be designed for the interior of the Miller House. The house was largely designed by that time, but they were still in some ways working out some of the internal details. And these are just some of the models that Balthazar produced in exploring different options for that, and then again using photography as a way to test out those different designs. These are model shots that he did to test out some of that interior. And you see some of the other Gerard pieces of the interior, the conversation pit and the long presentation and storage wall in the back. After the project was built, he was sent to document the project, as was Ezra Stoller. And Stoller's photographs were really the photographs that were principally used in two major publications that highlighted the project shortly after its completion in 1958, House and Garden and Progressive Architecture. And those were really, in many ways, some of the only published images of that house for decades. The Millers were rather private people, and so most people knew that house through this the Stoller shoot, which was a 2-day shoot. I think he shot something like 53 photographs over 2 days at one time period. Balthazar, however, kept returning to the house for over a 40-year process. Balthazar got the commission to shoot almost all of the mid-century modern architecture that was being built in Columbus at the time, and he had an open invitation to the Millers. He became quite good friends with J. Irwin and Xenia Miller. So anytime he was in Columbus, he would stop by their house and photograph it. And over that 40-year period, shot over 1,800 images of the house, which today in our digital camera world doesn't sound like a lot, but at the time that was quite an extensive collection of images. And he shot it at every time of day, every season. As was mentioned in last night's keynote lecture, the interior designed by Gerard was swapped out seasonally, if not quarterly. And so I asked him at one time, I said, Balthazar, why did you keep going back? Like, weren't 1,300 images enough? And he said, well, every time I went, it was different. And so he just, again, it was this idea of capturing as much as possible the full and extensive life of a building. And so these are just a sampling of some of the images. You can see in the upper left the warm weather interior versus the cold weather interior in the lower right. Various shots from the interior looking out into the landscapes designed by Dan Kiley. And then, again, many of the interior details, much of which were designed by Gerard, the rugs and tapestries and textiles, and then really trying to capture the project in its fullest extent here in the spring, fall, spring and summer. Much of the artwork and sculpture, the Henry Moore sculpture, reclining woman at the end of the alley. And even in the winter. And so in many ways, I think his portfolio, which was not terribly well known until he gifted many of his images to the Eero Saarinen archive at the Library of Congress, which are now many of these are available through the Library of Congress. But these were really not well known and published until recently, which I think really, as I mentioned, give a much more kind of full understanding of the house itself. As I mentioned, he also worked on the TWA terminal project. This was a project that was underway shortly after he arrived in the office. And he was tasked with documenting a lot of the design process. As I'm sure many of you know, the Saarinen office was known for using a lot of large-scale model making and full-scale mock-ups as part of the design process, something that I think Eero Saarinen was really influenced by the automobile industry in that respect. And Balthazar was tasked with documenting much of that process. So here you see a lot of the model shots, these incredibly large-scale models that were used both to figure out the complex geometries. There are quotes from many people in the office, Gunnar Birkerts, as well as Cesar Pelli and Kevin Roach, who said that they couldn't draw the building. They couldn't draw it first. They were doing drawings based on the models because the geometries were so complex. And so they were constantly working and reworking those models. And Balthazar was documenting much of that process. Figuring out, in this case, the large structural piers. And you can see in many cases, the image in the lower right, he was using multiple exposure images to try to capture some of those complex geometries. Using quite literally, as he said, smoke and mirrors. They only built the model in one half, and then would use a mirror to mirror that in the photographs. And he said they would blow cigarette smoke into the model to give it the kind of a certain atmospheric quality. There you can see the mirror in the image in the lower right. Many of these were shot in color transparencies and slides to present to the clients as we're seeing them now, large format. The clients rarely ever saw the models themselves, but they saw these types of images of the models. And you can really see the process too, the design process in some of these images. You can notice in the kind of upper left corner, you can see some of the tape holding together. These were really quick models using what we would call chipboard today. And you can see in the ceiling pattern a lot of the tape and glue holding these models together. But as they continue to refine these images, you'll see that that ceiling was then later covered with a kind of plaster as the design became more and more refined. He was also exploring and experimenting different printing processes. This is a quote from Cesar Pelli, who wrote a foreword for the book on Balthazar that I published a couple of years ago, and he talks about his use of these experimental methods of printing to try to recreate or create the kind of concrete texture and that the building would have through these model shots. And in fact, it was his documentation of the project that was often used to introduce this project to the public. These are some spreads from an article in Architectural Forum in 1958. All of the images, with the exception of the drawings, all the photographic images were images that Balthazar Korab had taken in the office at the time, really introducing this project to the public. He was then sent out on site to document the construction process as well. And these are some of the images of that process. And then, of course, when the project was completed, he was then sent back out to the project to document its completion. And these are some of the photographs from those shoots. For a project of this complexity, I can only imagine that, having shot the models and the construction process and knowing the project in such detail really helped him in photographing the project upon its completion. It just gave him certain insights, I think, that he wouldn't have otherwise had, and also the fact that he was trained in architecture. Now, during that time when he was working in the office, his friend Peter Kolar, with whom he had fled Budapest, by that time had moved to Australia and contacted Balthazar and asked him if he wanted to enter the Sydney Opera House competition with him in 1956. And so Balthazar had to take a leave of absence from the Saarinen office because Saarinen was on the jury. And so he left the office for a time, although he continued to get photographic commissions from Saarinen during that time period. Many of those images then would be published in many of the leading journals at the time. So he was quickly gaining a reputation as a photographer. But these are just a couple of the images from their entry. They did receive an honorable mention. They got fourth place and an honorable mention in the competition. He then later took another leave of absence to enter again with Peter Kolar. Entered the competition for the Toronto City Hall project. And at that point, he said that he had a conversation with Saarinen, again was on the jury, so he had to again take a leave. And Saarinen said, you've got to stop entering all these competitions. And he said, well, you've got to stop being on the jury of all these competitions. So it was around that time in 1958 that Balthazar was gaining such popularity as a photographer and getting commissions from other architects that he decided to open his own studio. Many of the architects that really first enlisted him as a photographer are many of the architects and designers we've been hearing about thus far, particularly this morning, those who were Michigan, either natives or had set up practices in Michigan, Minoru Yamasaki being one of them. Balthazar shot almost everything that Yamasaki did. In fact, there was a self-published book on retrospective on Yamasaki that Yamasaki published himself, and I think every image in the book was a Balthazar Korab image, not just of the buildings themselves, but here, as you can see, he was also documenting many of the models that were produced for Yamasaki's projects in his studio. And again, he would thoroughly document the model and design process, and then later the finished buildings, as you see here with the World Trade Center. He also shot extensively many of the most well-known Yamasaki buildings here in Michigan. In this case, the McGregor Memorial Conference Center at Wayne State. Again, many of these images would then appear in major publications, in this case, Architectural Forum of 1958, in which case Balthazar also got the cover photograph. The Reynolds Metals Regional Sales Office in Southfield, Michigan, which I hear now is empty or was a Bally's gym at one time. Hopefully this is restored to its previous glory. But this was Architectural Forum of 1959. Again, an extensive survey of that building. And this image here on the left was an image that Balthazar submitted to the AIA color photography competition, the national competition in 1961, for which he won second place. I'll return to that in a moment. But he was also getting commissions from other Midwest architects. In this case, obviously, Mies van der Rohe's office in Lafayette Park. Balthazar also shot almost everything Mies's office did, although he never met Mies. He was one of the few greats, modern greats, that Balthazar said he never met personally. But he had a personal contact in the office. Peter Carter, who had worked in Eero Saarinen's office, later moved to Chicago to work with Mies and was instrumental in getting Balthazar a lot of those commissions. In this case, an image of Lafayette Park when Caldwell's landscape is, as you can see, really in its infancy. Again, those kinds of images would then show up in these other kinds of trade brochures. In this case, a brochure for the Ownership magazine, which is a real estate magazine. In this case, singing the praises of the innovative approach to parking, the peekaboo parking at Lafayette Park, which in many ways conceals some of the cars parking within those recessed parking spots within the landscape. As was mentioned this morning by Eric Hill, Bill Kessler was also instrumental in not only the kind of mid-century modern movement in Michigan, but really instrumental in launching Balthazar's career as a photographer. He documented, in this case, Kessler's house in 1959, the Lester Kirk Center at Olivet College Student Center in 1964. And the Mount Clemens Savings and Loan Bank, which was shown earlier this morning, this was great. Balthazar was there to photograph the building, and just so happened to be that there was also a promotional advertising shoot going on at the time. So he also documented this other shoot. Again, these kinds of images were then published in the major journals, in this case Architectural Forum in 1961. And as I mentioned, he entered that image, the color image of the Reynolds in the lower right, into the AIA photography competition. And he won second place to the image there in the middle, the image by probably one of the most famous images by Julius Schulman of Koenig's Case Study House, I think number 22. Balthazar prides himself on the fact that then 3 years later, he beat out Schulman for the AIA gold medal in photography. And after winning that AIA gold medal in photography, his practice was burgeoning. He had a young family. Things were just crazy. He decided to take a 1-year sabbatical to go and live in Italy. He didn't really have many plans for that trip, so this is a little diversion from Michigan, but it'll bring us back to Michigan, and there's some Michigan connections within this trip as well. He had no real plans for the trip. He and his second wife, Monica, and their 2 children, Christian and Alex, moved to Florence in 1966. And it was really just a way for him to rejuvenate and refresh. Unbeknownst to him, it would produce some of the most instrumental projects in his career, non-commissioned or commissioned in a different way. 10 days after they arrived, Florence was hit with one of the worst floods in the history since the 14th century. In November 4, 1966. And Balthazar, in his own words, said he was one of the few photographers stupid enough to run down there and try to document it. And he shot every roll of film he had with him, both 2.25 and 35 millimeter. These are some of the images that he shot. He said at times he was up to his chest in flowing water. And some of the major destruction you can see. He then drove to Rome the next day to process all the film and sold some of the images to Life magazine and the AP, and earned enough money selling those images to extend his stay in Italy for a whole another year. He was commissioned then by National Geographic to document much of the restoration process. In this case, you can see pages of manuscript, medieval manuscripts drying out. In this case, they're hanging to dry in a heating plant in the railroad station. They also use tobacco barns to dry them out. And then here you can see the actual original Ghiberti Gates of Paradise panels being removed from the baptistry doors in San Giovanni. Those obviously those originals are no longer on the baptistry itself. They're in the museum, but those were the originals at the time. As I mentioned, he was commissioned by National Geographic to then, for over a year, document a lot of the restoration process of the city. And again, that helped finance his stay in Italy for another year. During which time he also was out traveled extensively throughout Italy, documenting the kind of built environment, really, of Italy. Everything from these kind of Tuscan hillsides, the agricultural landscapes of Tuscany and Umbria, and the Korobs had an apartment in Settignano, a small city overlooking Florence to the north and slightly east. And they lived quite close to Villa Gambaria. And so, after spending days down in the kind of dirty city after the floods, he would retreat to the hills and would oftentimes meander over to Villa Gambaria and started photographing that villa. He struck up a friendship with many of the gardeners there, and he gave each of them images, and those images caught the attention of the owner of the villa, who then invited the family for dinner and proposed doing a publication, which they did, was published in 1970, of Villa Gambaria. If you go there today, you can still buy the book at their little gift shop for about €80, which is, I recommend doing so because the Korobs and others sell it for about $400. But during that time, he also was contacted by a friend of his from Detroit, Astra Zarina, who had worked in Yamasaki's office. She was the first woman to win the Rome Prize in Architecture and was in Rome for that, and also other opportunities, other fellowships. That kept her in Rome for several years, and she continued to return in later in her life as an instructor at the University of Washington in Seattle. But at that time, she proposed a project, a 2-year project, documenting the roofscapes of Rome. That's Astra there in the lower image and Balthazar in the upper image. And it really became this amazing, extensive survey of the roofscapes throughout Rome. He shot over 3,600 images during this time period. And again, I think this is both part of his kind of urge to document these buildings and the city in its kind of fullest extent, images that or views of the city that we hardly ever get, unless at this point we're lucky enough to know somebody who lives in one of these roofscapes. At the time, that was all the cheap rent. There were no air conditioners and elevators. So that's where, as he said, all of the expats and poets and writers lived. And so they had this kind of circle, this bohemian circle, as he said, that gained them access to many of these rooftop terraces from which he shot a lot of these images, really reframing many of the monumental works of architecture that we know from the city, but have hardly ever seen them in this manner. But also really trying to capture the daily lives of what it was like. It was like a city above the city, as he talked about it, and really trying to capture what that was, what that other city was like in the fullest extent. When he returned from Italy, then 2 years later, he said he had kind of fallen off the radar of many of the practices that would often call on him to shoot work. But he relied heavily on those connections that he had made earlier and through the Saarinen office, and architects like Gunnar Birkerts would hire Balthazar, again, to document both design processes and finished projects. In this case, the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis, which he also photographically documented the construction process. And also I haven't got my hands on it yet, but there's a 16 millimeter film that he shot commissioned by the construction company who built the building in Minneapolis as well. Again, many of these images were then used in major publications, in this case, Architectural Record of 1973. He also documented many of the works that we've seen and discussed already in the symposium, in this case, St. Francis de Sales Church in Muskegon, but also many of the projects that, again, those connections he had made in Detroit and in Michigan, in this case, Yamasaki's Rainier Bank Tower in Seattle. Later, Bill Kessler projects, in this case, the Detroit Receiving Hospital, and even Richard Meyer's Douglas House in Harbor Springs. Now, at that time, really in the late 60s or mid to late 70s, Monica, in an interview with Monica, talked a lot about the kind of transformation of these urban centers and the desire of many of the hotel corporations to create these fully, these kind of complete environments, these conference centers and convention centers for the burgeoning corporate elite in the United States. And Balthazar was commissioned by both Hyatt Regency and Westin. I think he traveled to at least 46 different hotels throughout the country and several more internationally to document this new, in many ways, a new typology of architecture. In this case, John Portman's Renaissance Center, which I'm sure you're all familiar with in Detroit. And these were the kinds of images that he was shooting for these brochures. So he would take, in many cases, take the whole family. They would go and stay at the hotel, and he would produce these images, which would later be used in these kind of brochure catalogs. He was also commissioned in 1975 to document Michigan architecture, significant architecture in Michigan, as part of the state's celebration of the National Bicentennial. This is a recollection of some of that process in a piece that he wrote for the magazine of the Michigan Society of Architects in 1989. But like I said, in 75, they commissioned Balthazar to shoot these significant works of architecture throughout the state of Michigan. And Balthazar, being Balthazar, they gave him a list of buildings they wanted him to shoot, but he couldn't stop at that list, and ended up over actually about a 2-decade period, created an incredibly extensive survey of architecture throughout the state of Michigan. And again, Balthazar being Balthazar, architecture wasn't just limited to the kinds of architecture that we know and love and appreciate here in the state of Michigan, like Cranbrook, which was only a mile away from his house and studio. So he visited that extensively, as he did with the Miller House and as he did with Villa Gambarai. He kept returning to Cranbrook for 4 decades and documenting that amazing collection of buildings. But he also included the industrial heritage of the city and also the vernacular heritage of the city. This historic image of historic Calumet and decommissioned copper mines in Quincy in the Upper Peninsula. These vernacular details, in this case of a stacked wood farm structure in the Upper Peninsula, and then even the kind of agricultural production and built environment, in this case vineyards in the Leelanau Peninsula in northern Michigan. And of course, the industrial heritage. He was interested in just capturing the fullest extent of the built environment throughout Michigan. And as we know and learned in this morning's lecture by Eric Hill, this industrial heritage really is enormously critical and responsible for much of what became the modern heritage of architecture and design in the state of Michigan. And Balthazar was instrumental in documenting a lot of that. He also was fascinated by car culture, the automobile culture here in Michigan, in the United States more generally, but obviously being in Michigan, he was surrounded by it. And again, for Balthazar, he was really interested in capturing that to the fullest extent possible. So everything from the stylings of the both historic and newer models of the automobile design, but also the kind of built environment that developed and grew up around that industry, used car dealerships and gas stations. Um, he was also commissioned by many of the public relations firms in the Detroit area. There were several incredibly large and important public relation firms in the Detroit area working with the automobile industry, but then of course other industries, the madmen of Detroit, I guess you could say. And he was commissioned in the mid 60s, 64 to 66, to document these images of the Lincoln Continental. Ford had developed a magazine. The Continental magazine was sort of lifestyle magazine, and Balthazar was sent out to photograph these kinds of staged images, oftentimes in front of mid-century modern architecture. In this case, a house by Gunnar Birkerts for Alfred Taubman. And these images would show up in the Continental Lifestyle magazine among articles about which cognac you should drink and what golf courses to play in Palm Springs. They had, these articles about the new Continental to be released in the following year. These are some of the images that Balthazar would shoot for that publication. Again, oftentimes situated in front of the cutting edge architecture of its day as well. But part of car culture for Balthazar was also these large kind of systems, the impact of the automobile industry on these kind of larger systems, industrial complexes like the River Rouge. But he was also sent to the Gulf of Mexico to document a lot of the oil rigs that were obviously feeding the petroleum for that automobile industry. Some of those commissions, though, came from other manufacturing and sources in Michigan. In this case, he was commissioned by the Michigan Seamless Tube Company, which created a lot of the large-scale metal tubes that were used in those oil rigs, which were used in these kinds of brochures. And the image there on the left was from that shoot. And he was also commissioned to photograph, in this case, from Hawthorne Metal Products Company, a metal stamping company that produced a lot of parts for the automobile industry. And again, many of Korob's images were then used in this case, the Hawthorne Metal Products Company brochure. And he was also commissioned by the American Trucking Association to document their trucks in use throughout the kind of highway system throughout the United States, creating these almost sublime images of this, in some ways, this new kind of landscape, really, this automobile landscape throughout the United States. But he also understood and was really compelled by the implications of, as he put it, the implications of our the automobile industry, the impact of the automobile industry on the larger environment, and that was something that he was well aware of. This is a letter that he wrote to then Senator Al Gore, soon to be Vice President Al Gore, and it was an image, or he included a series of images from throughout Michigan, and which really documented the loss of the enormous indigenous, in this case, white pines throughout Michigan that had been cut down during the lumber for the lumber industry, and really understood there's a certain kind of melancholy and beauty, both beauty and melancholy, in many of the images that he shot, both of these kinds of landscapes and these sorts of industrial landscapes. And Balthazar was really intent on capturing that fullest scope of the built environment in Michigan, which is in many ways a consequence of that modern and industrialized movement that created the modern movement in Michigan. This is a quote from Monica about Balthazar and his fascination with these kind of vernacular and industrial landscapes. She said, Balthazar, who was a perpetual foreigner in a strange land, was often more enthusiastic exploring vernacular subjects, and I would include in that those kinds of industrial landscapes, than any of his other projects, because they went beyond the architecture into a much broader expression of a particular culture. Everything was new and worth examining, and I think he saw something in America, an explosive push to build differently from his European roots and to extend beyond our own history that was fascinating and yet unsettling in many respects. And I think in some ways that also encapsulates one of his most interesting commissions. In 1994, he was contacted by the State Department and asked to curate a collection of images to be given to the then president of Hungary. President Clinton was traveling to Budapest for an economic summit, and they wanted to bring a presidential gift. And so Balthazar curated about 40 images, which he was told by the State Department were then laid out on the floor of the Oval Office, and President Clinton selected 12 of those images to be put together as this gift to the president of Hungary. And of those 12 images, these are the 12 images that were selected. 6 of them are either in Michigan or have a connection to Michigan. There's a small schoolhouse in northern Michigan. I think this image here in the snow is from the Upper Peninsula, a farm, image of a farm in the Upper Peninsula. Washington Boulevard in Detroit. Saarinen's, obviously St. Louis Arch. That's a small farmhouse in Frankenmuth, Michigan, and then Yamasaki's Twin Towers. And he said the images that he curated, he was trying to curate a selection of images that would in some ways represent the transformation of an agrarian society to an industrial society, which he felt after the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, Hungary was going to as he figured, would go through a similar kind of transformation. And so that was the kind of overarching theme of the images that he selected. Later in his career, he remained active into the 21st century. These are some of the images that he continued to document in the late 20th and early 21st century at Cranbrook. I was lucky to be with Balthazar and Christian on what was probably Balthazar's last shoot in 2010 at the Bloomfield Township Public Library, which he had also shot in 1950s, in the 50s, mid to late 50s. And at that time, he and his son Christian would work collaboratively on these shoots. He was an incredibly active gardener at his home and studio in Troy, Michigan. And these are some of the images that I took during my numerous visits to their house and studio, looking through the archive. I did about 36 hours of interviews with Balthazar and Monica during that time period. And this was an image that was shot, I think, in the early 90s. They used a gymnasium floor in a middle school to document all the publications that he had images either published in or on the cover of. And that's all I have. So.